the manifesto was commissioned in 1847 by an organization called the Communist League, and it was published then in 1848. I did find it really interesting to read. It was in Tariq's article that Marx kind of procrastinated on writing it and didn't really get around to it until until they really lit a fire under his butt, got a little pissed off, and gave him like a really firm deadline. I can relate to that quite a bit. That's kind of how I function too. So during that time period in Europe, there's actually a great deal of oppression taking place against left-wing radicals already. I know that for me, at least in school, what little I was taught about the Communist Manifesto basically implied that like Marx came up with the ideas in the manifesto out of nowhere, all by himself, and they never really mentioned anything that may have been going on to inform or inspire it. But things were already pretty tense between the European elites and the working class at that time. There'd been a number of, smaller uprisings. And the elites in several countries had secret police keeping tabs on revolutionary organizing. And radicals were routinely being exiled from their countries for their political beliefs. The Communist League that commissioned this work actually had a lot of people in it who had been exiled from various countries when they commissioned this work. So the terms communism and socialism were already in regular use. In fact, the manifesto opens up with the statement that the specter of communism is haunting Europe. So the idea that Marx and Engels came up with this all on their own is kind of silly. The ideas that they eventually organized into the manifesto had been out there circulating for a while. In fact, Ali talks about how folks were desperate for a manifesto that could both express the hopes and challenge the political energies of the workers at the time. Let's see. So both Marx and Engels worked on organizing all the ideas and putting all the theories together. It was Marx that wrote the final draft that was published. And it was organized into 4 parts or 4 chapters, depending on how you look at it. The first part really focuses on explaining the theory of historical materialism. This is the idea that our material conditions are ultimately what powers the engine of all change throughout history. And this is demonstrated primarily in this part by explaining how capitalism developed and why it inherently results in the exploitation of the working class. Basically, he goes over all of the revolutions that overthrew feudalism, how they were primarily orchestrated by people who weren't aristocracy, but were still wealthy and powerful. So like merchants and businessmen, people like that who had a lot of money and power as the Industrial Revolution was starting to take place. And because they were the ones that orchestrated these revolutions and set up the new systems, these systems were set up to benefit them. They essentially just replaced the former class structure with a new one, switching over from kings to capitalists, or the bourgeoisie being at the top of the class structure. They then go on to explain how the resulting class structure exploits workers. And, I know most folks here don't really need this explained to them, that capitalists own the means of productions, all the factories, all the machinery and stuff needed to create goods, but they have to hire workers in order to run this stuff. They can't do it all on their own. So they pay for the labor of the workers to create the goods, which they then sell. And they sell the goods for more than what they paid the workers to produce them. So the workers aren't getting paid the full value of their labor. The capitalists then pocket the difference. That's what profits are. And because the workers have nothing to sell but their labor, and they need money for things like food and shelter, they're kind of stuck in this situation. It's work or die, right? And their labor is inherently exploited because they're not getting paid what it's worth. Workers additionally are forced to compete with each other for jobs, and forcing them to compete to sell their labor does not only lower the value of their labor so that capitalists can get it for cheaper and they are more easily exploited, but it also degrades social ties between workers. And to me, I feel like the implications of this are super clear, that it results in like a social isolation and extreme individualism that cuts people off from support networks, which means they become more desperate when they're in trouble because they don't have those support networks to help them. It makes them more easily exploitable because they don't have those things to turn to in their community. It makes organizing more difficult, and it just contributes to the overall lowered living standards that of workers that capitalism produces. Um, but this chapter goes through all of this, and then it actually ends on what I felt like was a pretty hopeful note. Um, Marx talks about how all of this results in a conflict between workers and capitalists that can't be resolved under the current system. And because this conflict can't be resolved, it's concluded that it is inevitable that the workers will eventually rise up and challenge the capitalist system. Famously, the manifesto states that capitalism produces its own grave diggers and that the workers will eventually challenge the system and bring about the victory of the proletariat. Um, so frequently before I had read this, I had been told that the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto is the most important one. And I can see where that's coming from, because it does really explain things out and just, makes it all make sense. It's really crucial information about how capitalism functions and what the problems are with it. You really can't challenge a system if you don't understand those things about it. However, personally, I really enjoyed the second chapter. And probably because it seems to address so many of the weird criticisms that are frequently brought up about communism today. The second chapter focuses a lot about ideas of property and whether or not private property is okay. And, I know personally, I hear a lot of people being very confused about that. There were times reading it that I could almost see Marx, that meme that's like a cartoon of Marx busting into a room with an AK-47 and he's like, I'm here for your toothbrush. I could like, I could almost feel how much he would have appreciated that. the snarkiness of it. Yeah, Kool-Aid Man style. As I was reading it, it was really great reading through it. But basically, the point of the second chapter is laying out a little bit of a vision for what an ideal communist society would look like, and that's why it talks about property stuff, because people then, as now, kind of freak out at the idea of private property being abolished. But he points out very accurately that private property had already been abolished for about 90% of the population. Most people don't have the ability and never will have the ability to own private property like that. Of course, everybody has personal property that they use for their own use, but the system was set up to deny people access to the type of property that produces wealth and goods. And the idea for Marx and Engels was, instead of setting up a society where those resources are used to enrich just a few people, we should set up a society where the point of production isn't profit, but rather meeting the needs of everyone equally. Let's see here. So this section had a list of 10 goals of the Communist Party that were pretty clear, and I think mostly applicable to today as well. Those goals were the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, abolition of all rights of inheritance, confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels. That one I think could maybe sit a little weird for people today, but I like in context. He's not meaning like, refugees, poor people come in here to just try and make better lives for themselves. Anyhow, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil, generally in accordance with a common plan. I feel like reading the improvement of the soil just feels so like modern to hear from a text from way back then. Like this was on people's radar back then, and people are still talking about it like it's an entirely new thing. As a horticulturist, that hits me in my heart. um, equal liability of all to work, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture, um, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. To me, that feels like he was kind of predicting the Green Revolution a little bit. I know he wasn't, but like sort of. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. I mean, hopefully in all forms, right? Combination of education with industrial production, etc. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that chapter just as much as the first. I feel like it's just as crucial. But I guess I do see where people are coming from when they say the first is the most important. Part 3 was the part that I probably found to be the least relevant to today. Well, at least to me, because it's just pretty much going over some criticisms against the theories presented in the manifesto that were prevalent at the time it was written. It examines each of these criticisms and rebuts them. And part 4 is the conclusion. And it really just ends on a note of solidarity with all revolutionary movements, which I thought was really cool. I joke all the time that like when people ask me, you know, what type of communist I am, I'm like, I just like solidarity. Solidarity is my favorite. So that felt cool. And of course, you know, it ends on the famous line asking workers of the world to unite. We've got nothing to lose but our chains. So that's pretty much a synopsis of the book as I understood it when I read it, going through. So, and like I said at the beginning of the presentation, I read these other articles about it, which I thought had interesting context, and it was really interesting seeing people in two different, very different eras, about 100 years apart, almost, talking about like, oh, well, what in the Communist Manifesto holds up today, right? And both Ali and Trotsky agree that like the methodology, the basic underlying theory, still holds up. And I agree. I feel like it still applies to everything I'm seeing that functions today in the world. The basic idea of class struggle and how capitalism essentially functions and exploits workers. Let's see here. What did I write? Both examinations of the manifesto discussed several points that didn't quite age so well. It's obvious that Marx and Engels, Marx and Engels themselves at one point admitted that the text had become a little bit antiquated. This was within their own lives. But they didn't want to alter the original text at that point because they felt like it'd become a historical document, and that's totally fair. It is obvious that they believed the revolution was a lot more imminent than it turned out being. Trotsky talks about how they kind of underestimated the future possibilities of capitalism. And I mean, that makes sense. How can you predict all the technological advances that came about, all the different changes to our material conditions that influenced it? So, I mean, it kind of, it's a little bit of a bummer because I feel like we could all be overestimating the situation right now as well, or underestimating capitalism and overestimating how ready the proletariat is to engage in revolutionary action. I think, especially as we tend to be in bubbles with other people who share our values, that's real easy to do, to overestimate where the general public is at. you know, Marx and Engels also predicted that the petty bourgeois would sort of like cease to exist as they got absorbed into the proletariat over time. And the need for them would be lessened, but that obviously did not turn out to be correct. Um, as Trotsky points out in his article, the development of capital has accelerated in the extreme the growth of legions of technicians, administrators, commercial employees, in short, the so called new middle class. It seems obvious to me that that has continued since he wrote that. And it's been rough on getting people to develop a greater sense of class consciousness, I think. Um, but both Trotsky and Ali point out in their articles the primary theory is solid um, and relevant today. Something that Ali stated in his article that I found really, I guess, impactful or poignant, is he mentions that we desperately need a new manifesto today, and I I agree with that, because the point of the original manifesto was to put together uh, ideas that were already existing in a coherent and concise way that could be used by workers to um, inspire them and to educate them and to get them to a better place of class consciousness, to wrap a bunch of complex ideas together. Um, and I feel like we could use that today. Like I said, the manifesto could be a little difficult to read for a lot of folks. And, you hear all the time people making jokes, shitting on like writing everything at an eighth grade level because people are so dumb. But you know what? If we were to write all this stuff down in an eighth grade level, I'll bet a hell of a lot more people would read it. And that's the goal, right? Is to get people to read it and to absorb these concepts and ideas. So I appreciated that he said that while still saying that like there's so much to learn in the manifesto and it's still worth reading and it's still relevant today. Um, that really stood out to me. And I think like a feeling I got from reading these, especially, is just like how over and over again throughout history, we've come up against the same challenges and it's come up against the same opportunities to do something about it. And so, like, what we do here in the Denver Communists is like preparing ourselves with the correct theory and knowledge uh, to be able to act when the time is right. And when I first started learning about that concept, there was a part of me that was afraid of like, well, if we're not ready when the time is right, will we miss our chance? But reading through all of this gave me the hopeful feeling that like there's always going to be another chance. It's going to keep happening over and over again because there's nothing out like the conflict can't be resolved any other way. So if, you know, a chance comes and we aren't successful that time or we aren't able to take that chance, there's going to be another one because unless both classes are destroyed, the conflict's going to keep coming up over and over again. And to me, I felt like that was a really hopeful message and it gave me a new perspective on what it is we're doing here and just, the goal overall. um, and so I found that to be really helpful.